Alright everyone, it's time to come to school. We're going to cover a bit of linguistics here. I have a suggestion for people who understand that well-regulated in the Second Amendment doesn't refer to government regulation. Oftentimes I see very obtuse attempts to explain, based on historical precedent, the usage of that term. And the problem is, with doing that, you're requiring the other person to overthink the subject and also potentially to read a bunch of boring stuff. I like history. I like SCOTUS decisions and flowery legalese and stuff, but that's a minority of the population. It's even a minority of people that are pro-gun and actually understand the tenement of the Second Amendment. So here's my suggestion. Simply compare the evolution of that term and its differential usage to terms that are more contemporary and have shifted similarly. For instance, the term cool. When I say that something is cool 100 years ago, I'm referring to its temperature. I'm not referring to it being fashionable. Today, it is more likely, unless it's used in a mechanical context, it's more likely that I'm saying, oh, cool, like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, it's fashionable and hip or something. You wouldn't ever see it used in that context 100 years ago. If you had a reference to something being cool in the Constitution, you would not construe it as meaning cool as the way people use it today. The usage of the term in general parlance has changed. It's more often used outside of the temperature context now. But if it were used in the Constitution, it wouldn't be able to be used in that manner because 200 years would elapse before it was ever used in that context. It would mean temperature. And depending on the wording, a person in modern times might misconstrue the usage and say, oh, well, it's referring to the founders found it cool to own slaves or something like that. Well, no, it would be used in a temperature context. They were referring to keeping the slave quarters cool during the summer. I know that this isn't in the Constitution, but we're giving an example that could be. You would not use it in the same context. The term epic. Epic being a bit more new than the Gen X or even boomerist usage of cool, which is still in usage today. It hasn't become uncool to say cool. There are other better alternatives. Epic. If you're talking about something being epic 100 years ago, you're not using it in the non-literary or mythological context. You're referring to an epic, so you're referring to some pagan material usually, some sort of epic poetry. Again, derived off of the initial term of an epic, this sort of adventure story. It evolves, it gets used for like epic poetry, so it's similar to those epic works. It's derived from them. That appears, I believe, in the 19th century. And now the term can be, again, used similar to how cool would be used. Although there's more of a tinge of adventurism to it, so something is specifically exciting. Not just cool as an interesting or hip or fashionable, but now it's also exciting in that sort of more adventurous sense. Oh man, that was so epic. Oh, you're talking about the roller coaster ride. But if you go back 100 years, you're not using it in that context. Again, somebody could get the wrong idea depending on how the structure of the sentence actually worked. What about tubular? This is a now defunct 80s term, lasted into the 90s, meaning cool, rad, or something like that. Again, these are similar terms. There's a reason why I'm using this particular collection here. Hip, of course, 100 years ago refers to the hip bone or something like that. You wouldn't see it in the modern context either. Tubular. If something is described of as tubular prior to this period of time, prior to the late pre-modern era, which is what the 80s or maybe 70s really are at this point. No internet, oh my god, those primitives. They didn't use LED lights and shit like that. You would be using it in the context of an actual tube. So if the founders had described something as tubular in the Constitution, referring to guns, while they thought guns were cool and tubular, they're not referring to that aspect of guns being interesting or cool. They're referring probably to the barrel of the gun, which is, quite literally, a tube. It's tubular in nature. That would be the usage. Again, you could misconstrue this if you didn't understand that there had been a modification of the general usage of the language, just like with regulated. What about bitchin? Valley Girl 80s reference there. Something that is bitchin, oh man, that's bitchin. Okay, so that's cool or that's something hip and trendy and that you want to do. If bitchin had been used in the Constitution, it would be referring to female dogs, or prostitution, potentially. Again, a differential parlance. The concept of a bitch as being an angry woman, an unlikable female individual, possibly with loose sexual tendencies, would not have been the general usage. That's effectively, I believe it's Shakespearean. It is an allusion to bitch as in a female dog, which is the literal and still used classification for a female dog. I think specifically one capable of being bred, if I remember correctly. Could be wrong on that one. Like, I like linguistics, but I can't know fucking everything. So when we look at well-regulated, the best way to explain to people why it doesn't refer to the government. Yes, I know it can't refer to soldiering, the militia specifically, because there was no standing army. And the second part of the Second Amendment explicitly talks about the people being the ones that it's referring to bearing arms. I understand that, but they get bogged down in the nuance that's lost when you interpret what well-regulated means. They're assuming that it's referring to government regulation. But regulation at large was used in a much wider variety of ways prior to the modern period. You would use it in a mechanical sense, so like you're regulating a watch. You would use it in a civic sense, which didn't necessarily mean a government. It could be a well-regulated public body of some other form that's simply well able to function. The militia, to be well-regulated, has to be well-armed enough to muster. Quite literally, the Second Amendment meaning of this actually goes entirely in a different direction from that which people who don't like guns propose. It's actually proposing the opposite. But you can't really make that case to someone who has cognitive dissonance without giving something similar that's very easy to understand. Just use terms like cool, or epic, or any other modern parlance in which the word that you are using, or the term potentially, let's say the term faceplant. This is a more modern term. I believe it originates with skateboarding, but I'm probably wrong because people will call me out, by the way. If I say anything historically inaccurate, all of a sudden the entire video is bullshit to them. To faceplant means you just fell down and you hit your face. If I saw this in a book 200 years ago, well, clearly nobody's skateboarding at the time. People aren't playing basketball and there are no curbs. They've got dirt roads generally. What are they referring to? They're probably referring to some species of plant that looks vaguely like humanoid in nature, maybe a mandrake or something like that. It would be very, very interesting. Or they're talking about some sort of lichenous life form that they discovered growing on some gangrene patient's face. That would be the only way in which that term could possibly be used. Now I'm wondering if I should do a crawl of literature to see if that actually appears in any pre-modern manuscripts. Somebody do that for me, because I got a million other things to do in the literary sense. If you can find evidence of that, a face plant being described in some botanical literature, I'm going to laugh my ass off. Give them an example specifically of a similar evolution of usage. Again, cool, it means temperature is rather low, at least relative to its surroundings. It's been cooled off. It has been reduced in temperature. It is generally outside of a laboratory, or remarks on the weather, no longer used in that context. We would say cold, generally speaking. It's used interchangeably. It's different degrees of coldness, but again, outside of those two contexts, generally you're saying something is cool. But you're not saying that its temperature's low. You're saying it's ice cold, man. You're saying that it's trendy, it's fashionable, it's desirable, maybe it's a fad, it doesn't really matter. Epic, bitchin, tubular. There are a million goddamn examples. To get canned. Well, if you're talking about it 200 years ago, you're not talking about someone getting fired from their job. It wouldn't be used in that context. That's, I think, dates to the atomic era. To be canned back then, if it's used, would be you're at the cannery and you're observing things getting canned. If a person gets canned, it means they got chopped up by cannibals and they got put in tin cans. Back then, I think they were lead-lined, so, brain damage became a little bit of a problem. Although modern discoveries, they have looked at that one ice wreck that they initially analyzed, found it a while ago. And like, oh, these people died of lead poisoning. And then they found that actually the lead hadn't seeped into the contents enough to cause that. So sadly, they didn't poison themselves drinking their canned fish. They just succumbed to the elements. I can't remember which one that was. One of those Arctic expeditions from the 19th century. Anyway, this is the way to go about it. create a comparison that is roughly comparable, and it gets past the cognitive dissonance. They haven't been trained to set up that defensive wall if you're referring to the evolution of similar terms, only for regulated. So you have to give comparisons that work around the mental block. That's about all. Peace out.